Hello, EDL 634. This is Adam Hall, and I am going to take the next couple of minutes and talk through some of the external standards that the care office at UNC Wilmington abides by and is kind of in adherence to. So today I'll be really focusing on three primary standards boards that really work closely with the care office, and then we really use as the guiding force for much of our work. It's kind of broken down into three different levels. If you think of the national work we do, the state level work, and then the student affairs work here on the campus. So the U.S. Department of Justice, the Office of Violence Against Women, we currently hold one. We are a grant recipient from them. Two of our staff members are actually funded through this program, as well as many of our programs are kind of implemented because of the guidelines and reinforcement that this program kind of sets out for us. The next level is for our advocacy staff. The North Carolina Victims Assistance Network provides a certification for all advocates in the state of North Carolina for nonprofit organizations as well as universities to participate in that program, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the coming slides. And then lastly, the Division of Student Affairs. And I know this is an external kind of dialogue, but for us in the care office, though this is internal to the university, we do a really unique mission in the care office. So the student affairs expectations and guidelines and vision really are in many ways an external standards board for our office, even though it is the unit within which we work on a much larger scale. So I want to go kind of section by section for these three levels and talk through not only the standards that are provided, but some of the accountability and enforcement that, or lack of enforcement in some cases, that these three agencies have. So OVW, the Office of Violence Against Women, our grant program that we work with, does provide annual guidelines and best practices. They require for new members, so the first time we went through this grant process, that we would do biannual trainings, if not more often than that. 3 or 4 times a year was not uncommon in our first grant cycle for us to go and do trainings with folks. And so they expected that we'd have participation, whether it be not only from our office, but also other organizations we're partnering with here at the university. And then they require an annual summary of all the work done on campus. So as we break down the positions here with the grant, how many clients are served in the office, both through the grant and not through the grant, how many programs are implemented, how many training programs, how many educational programs. And so we'll get into a little bit of that at the end of what they're actually looking for and asking for. The accountability side is it's pretty streamlined. Either grant programs are meeting expectations and everything is moving forward, that the grant agency believes that there needs to be some remedial and required action to change how the office is functioning with the monies given, and if those expectations are not met and those behaviors are not changed, those actions are not taken, then funding will be removed. From my research on this process, I can only find one instance where the Office of Violence Against Women actually removed funding, and it was from a local agency who failed to meet multiple levels of what the grant was requiring. The next level here is the state level with the NC VAN, so NC Victim Assistance Network. Their standards are much more lax. They're pretty straightforward as well. They really do come from North Carolina state law, which is interesting when one considers that there's actually not much written into the North Carolina state law around advocacy and requirements, but they have implemented some baseline expectations that there needs to be at least 20 hours of training within crisis response and advocacy. This training actually is a 40-hour initial training and then with expectations of follow-up. They do provide annual trainings and best practices to members, as well as they do hold biannual trainings for new folks coming into the work. The accountability enforcement is pretty low level. There is, for insurance purposes, many institutions as well as local agencies do really prefer to have this certification. It is a protection for all advocates within an organization. But there are timeline restrictions. So advocates do need to participate in 9 minimum additional ongoing training hours, whether through webinars, additional in-person trainings, courses in social work, or other kind of similar training opportunities. And this is an every three-year accreditation. And once if you lose that accreditation, you actually have to start back at the beginning. They believe that if you've not trained at all in 3 years, that you really do need to go back through the basics. So it's really interesting that there isn't really a punishment from the organization, but there are negative consequences within the state of North Carolina if there aren't a certain number of advocates within office, and there's a liability for not malpractice in the sense of medical malpractice, but malpractice in the sense of advocacy and support services. And then the last level, kind of the most honed level, is really the standards for the Division of Student Affairs, aligning them very closely with the division's mission and vision. There's multiple reports and follow-up conversations. So we do a mid-year report every year. We do an annual report including that mid-year information, providing insights into issues and struggles and all these other pieces. And it ranges usually between 20 and 40 pages depending on the busyness of the year. And then, as you can imagine, the accountability enforcement of any office within a larger division is that there can be reassignments, refundings, transfers, terminations, realignments of budgets. We are trying to maximize our return on investment many times over in student affairs, because we do often have such a small budget to work with. And so I think that's a really interesting piece there, is that the disciplinary or enforcement part really does revolve around person power and financial resources. So those 3 levels really should give you some insight into kind of where we work within the care office, both on the prevention side and working with the division and those guiding practices and the Office of Violence Against Women, but also on the advocacy side, where there's expectations that great work is being done and it's really being tracked through certification. So how these are really utilized, and looking again at these 3 levels, OVW is very impactful for how we report our information, how we track it, who is responsible for certain tasks around the office so that it can then be actually accounted for in the work that we're doing. Switching from having one prevention staff who predominantly focuses on training, say, student leaders, to switching them to working with faculty and staff, because we need to increase our number of faculty-staff contacts. The intentionality behind a lot of these decisions is run by this. NC VAN, this for me really connects with the new expectations of staff members and getting them engaged and getting them trained to understand the dynamics of all forms of interpersonal violence that they may come in contact with, as well as the resources and entities in which it's important to work with. So this is really done early on in folks' careers, as well as then that kind of minimal impact after that first year of maintaining that accreditation. And then I think in terms of Division of Student Affairs, how it's utilized is really on the ground every day. That we are trying to meet the expectations of the division leadership and support for all of the decision making that they're having, is really making our decisions, is guiding them in many ways. And then some considerations of how this could change or grow. In many ways, there's a lot of redundancy in the information that's provided, both in the Office of Violence Against Women and the UNCW. They do require a great deal of information, but it tends to be redundant. There's certain expectations around number of programs, number of student contacts, number of passive and active program information being provided. It takes a number of different hours to set up and then disseminate to the leadership. The scale of information is definitely something else that should be considered. What I mean by that specifically is that there's often a substantial amount of detail of generic deliverables throughout all this, and so often there may be some information that isn't as relevant or as important to the care office and how we do our work versus maybe the university's mission. And so in finding a balance between how many times do we use a certain type of space or place versus what do we actually talk about and what were students learning. I think often in the Division of Student Affairs we can get lost in the logistics of spaces and places versus deliverables and outcomes. Because that is the nature of a student affairs division, that we are a little bit of everything. We're a little bit everywhere. And then lastly, I think the update and deliverables, being an office and being a unit that does a lot of progressive work, it doesn't actually have a checkbox or an already set up line of details of what we should be doing. Really updating the deliverables to our agencies, that our reporting mechanisms and the conversations that are being talked about are actually relevant, that we're not talking about, say, tertiary or secondary violence prevention programming, when really what we want to be talking about is tertiary. So really looking at how do we prevent the violence instead of just helping address the issues of interpersonal violence on the campus. There are some subtleties and nuances there, but I think the importance of updating those documents and getting everybody above the care office on board with these understandings is critical to the success of the office and moving forward. So those are my big takeaways from this activity. It was very insightful to kind of consider the work that the care office is doing in multiple different lights, and really the folks who are guiding us intentionally and unintentionally in our work. One of the greatest realizations that I had during this was that many of the decisions that I make on a day-to-day basis are very much influenced by 3 different large organizations above my head, and meeting their expectations and making them look good, and not having surprises, or hopefully anticipating some concerns that may or may not come down the pipe. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time to watch this video, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, comments, or concerns at my email below, and thanks so much.